I opened my front door at 6 in the morning to find a tow truck backing into my driveway and a woman in a teal puffer coat pointing at my car like it had personally insulted her family. My name is irrelevant, but my job is not. I am a barber in Roseville, California, and I hear everything. Every grudge, every complaint, every whispered fear about money or neighbors or the next board meeting. I moved to the Meadows Landing Association 3 months ago because the rent was decent and my landlord swore the HOA was hands-off. That was a lie. The Meadows Landing is an older planned neighborhood with a powerful board and longtime feuds baked into every sidewalk crack. My landlord has a lender requirement that says no HOA violations on file or the lease converts to month, and I lose my locked rate. I cannot afford that. The HOA knows it. The first sign of trouble was not the tow truck. It was the heated bird bath I installed on my porch railing 2 weeks earlier to keep water from freezing so the juncos and sparrows could drink. Brenda, the communications director, claimed it attracted pests. She is actually named Irene Baker, but everyone calls her Brenda because she has that energy. She has gray hair and a pixie cut, a teal puffer coat, and a teal knit hat she wears like a crown. She also carries a cheap flashlight headlamp everywhere, the kind with an elastic strap that leaves a red mark on her forehead. The tow truck driver was already out of the cab when I stepped outside. He was a big guy with a reflective vest and a clipboard, and he did not look happy to be there. Brenda stood next to him with her own clipboard, smiling. She said, "Good morning. Your vehicle is in violation of overnight parking regulations and will be removed immediately." I said, "My car is in my assigned spot." She said, "The board updated the winter interpretation last night. All vehicles must be moved to the visitor lot during snow events to allow plow access." I said, "What snow event? We got 2 inches 3 days ago and it has been plowed twice." She said, "The rule is the rule." I looked at the tow driver. He shrugged. I said, "Can I see the written update?" She said it was emailed to all residents. I said, "I did not get an email." She said, "That is not my problem." Then she said her line. She said, "You cannot prove anything." I had my phone in my jacket pocket and I turned on the voice recorder without looking. I said, "So you are towing my car right now based on a rule change I never received?" She said, "Correct." I said, "And if I move it to the visitor lot right now?" She said, "Too late. The tow is already authorized." I said, "By who?" She said, "By me. I am the communications director and I have enforcement authority." The tow driver looked uncomfortable. He said, "Ma'am, if he is willing to move it." She cut him off. She said, "I am calling management right now." She pulled out her phone and made a show of dialing. I let her talk. I let her explain to whoever was on the other end that I was non-compliant and belligerent and that the town needed to proceed. I watched her pile on threats, because that is exactly what I needed her to do. When she hung up, she said, "They agree. Move your car or it gets towed. Your choice." I said, "Fine. I will move it." She said, "No. The authorization is already in." The driver looked at me. He said, "Look, man, I do not want to be in the middle of this. If you move it, I am leaving." I said, "Thank you." I got in my car and moved it to the visitor lot while Brenda stood on my walkway fuming. The driver packed up and left. She did not. She came up the steps and said, "I need your gate code." I said, "What gate code?" She said, "The side yard gate. The board requires access for winter inspections." I said, "There is no gate. My side yard is open." She said, "Then I need your house key for interior inspection." I said, "Absolutely not." She said, "The CC&Rs allow the board to inspect for code violations." I said, "They allow exterior inspections." She said, "I am calling management right now." She did. This time she was on speaker. The management company representative said, "Miss Baker, we have no record of an interior inspection request." She said, "I am filing one right now." The representative said, "That requires 72 hours notice and owner consent." She said, "He is a renter." The representative said, "Then it requires landlord consent." She hung up. She looked at me and said, "This is not over." She walked down the steps and across the lawn to her car. I noticed she left a single sheet of paper tucked under my door handle. I pulled it out. It was a blank violation notice with her handwritten note at the top. It said, "Compliance required by 5 p.m. today or daily fines begin tomorrow morning." I went inside and called my landlord. He said, "What did you do?" I said, "I put up a bird bath." He said, "Take it down." I said, "It is not against the rules." He said, "I do not care. Take it down or I am not backing you." I said, "If I take it down, she will just find something else." He said, "That is your problem." I hung up. I called the management company and got transferred 4 times before I reached someone who said they handled Meadows Landing. I explained the situation. She said, "Do you have the email about the parking rule change?" I said no. She said, "Let me check." She put me on hold for 6 minutes. When she came back, she said, "There is no record of a rule change email. The last update was in August." I said, "So the tow was unauthorized?" She said, "I cannot comment on that. You will need to file a formal complaint." I said, "How?" She said, "In writing to the board within 10 business days." I said, "She said daily fines start tomorrow." She said, "That is between you and the board." I hung up. I spent the rest of the day at the shop cutting hair and listening. One of my regulars, a retired attorney named Paul, asked how the new place was. I told him. He said, "You are recording everything, right?" I said, "I started today." He said, "Good. Get her to repeat the authority claim. If she says she has enforcement power she does not actually have, that is your leverage." He also said, "You need a mediator on record, someone neutral who can testify you tried to resolve it properly." I said, "Who?" He said, "There is a guy named Sam Torres. He does HOA mediation in Placer County. Call him." I did. Sam answered on the second ring. I explained the situation. He said, "Do not take the bird bath down. Do not admit fault. Do not sign anything. File a complaint in writing tomorrow and copy me. I will send a letter to the board requesting a mediation session. If they refuse, that helps you later." I said, "Helps me how?" He said, "In court." I said, "I do not have court money." He said, "You might not need it. Just keep records." I hung up and went back to work. At 4:30 p.m. my phone buzzed. It was an email from Brenda with the subject line, "Final Notice." The body said, "Your violation remains unresolved. Fines of $50 per day begin at 12:01 a.m. tomorrow, unless full compliance is achieved by end of business today." Below that was a scanned PDF of a rule excerpt. It did not mention bird baths, it mentioned exterior decorations requiring board approval. I replied and said, "A bird bath is not a decoration. It is a functional wildlife feature." She replied in 2 minutes. She said, "Intent is irrelevant. Compliance is mandatory. I am calling management right now." I did not wait for her to call anyone. I grabbed my phone and my keys and drove to the HOA office. It is a small building near the community center with fake wood siding and a faded Meadows Landing Association sign. The lights were off, but I saw Brenda's car in the lot. I parked and walked up to the door. It was locked. I knocked. She came to the window and mouthed, "We are closed." I held up my phone and mouthed, "Open the door." She shook her head. I said, loud enough for her to hear through the glass, "I am requesting the meeting minutes and the rule change documentation." She said, through the glass, "Request it in writing." I said, "I am requesting it now under California Civil Code." She said, "Come back tomorrow." I said, "The fine starts tonight. I need the documentation now." She said, "You cannot prove anything." I held up my phone. I said, "I am recording this." She went pale. She said, "You are not allowed to record on HOA property." I said, "This is a public access office." She said, "It is closed." I said, "Then open it and give me the documents." She disappeared from the window. 2 minutes later, the door opened. She had a folder in her hands and her cheap flashlight headlamp on her head, even though the sun had not set yet. She said, "Here, meeting minutes from the last 6 months. No rule changes." I said, "What about the email you claimed you sent?" She said, I do not have access to the email server right now. I said, so you did not send it. She said, I sent it. You did not receive it. That is a technical issue. I said, or you never sent it and you are lying. She said, I am calling management right now. I said, go ahead. I already talked to them. They have no record of any rule change. She said, that is impossible. I said, show me the board vote. She said, what? I said, any rule change requires a board vote. Show me the minutes. She opened the folder and flipped through pages. She stopped. She closed the folder. She said, the vote happened in executive session. I said executive sessions are for personnel and legal issues, not rule changes. She said, you do not know what you are talking about. I said, I have a mediator and an attorney advising me. Do you? She said nothing. I said, I am filing a formal complaint tomorrow and requesting an emergency hearing. She said, you cannot do that. I said, yes, I can. She said, you will lose. I said, maybe. But you will have to show up and answer questions under oath. She stepped back. She said, get off HOA property. I said, gladly. I took a photo of the office door with my phone. She said, delete that. I said, no. I walked back to my car. That night I wrote the complaint. I kept it short. I said, I installed a heated bird bath on my porch railing to provide water for wildlife during winter. On December 14th, Communications Director Irene Baker claimed it violated HOA rules and attempted to have my vehicle towed under a parking rule change that does not exist. She has since threatened daily fines starting December 15th and demanded access to my home without proper notice or authority. I request an emergency hearing to resolve this matter and to investigate whether Ms. Baker has the legal authority to issue fines or authorize towing. I attached the voice recording of her claiming enforcement authority. I sent it to the management company, the board president, and Sam Torres. I copied Brenda. I sent it at 11 p.m. At 11:15, my doorbell camera caught Brenda walking up to my porch. She was wearing her headlamp and carrying a clipboard. She looked directly at the camera, then stuck an orange paper to my door with packing tape. She said, loud enough for the mic to catch, compliance required immediately. This is your final warning. Then she turned and walked away. I saved the video. The next morning I woke up to 6 emails. 4 were automated notices from the management company saying my account had been flagged for violation review. 1 was from Sam Torres saying he had received my complaint and sent a formal mediation request to the board. The last was from Brenda. It said, your hearing is scheduled for December 23rd at 6 p.m. in the community center. Attendance is mandatory. Failure to appear will result in automatic lien filing. I replied and said, I will be there. She did not reply. I called Sam. He said, good, do not bring the bird bath. Do not bring attitude. Bring documents. Bring the recordings. Bring a timeline. I said, what if they vote against me anyway? He said, then you take it to small claims and you win. But let us try this first. I said, what are the chances? He said, honestly, 50-50. The board has a lot of discretion. But if she lied about her authority, that is a problem for her, not you. I hung up and went to work. That week I had 3 more encounters. The first was on December 16th. I came home to find Brenda standing in my side yard with a tape measure and a notebook. I said, what are you doing? She said, measuring your fence setback. I said, I do not have a fence. She said, exactly. You are required to have a fence. I said, no, I am not. She said, check the rules. I said, I did. There is no fence requirement. She said, there is a landscaping standard. Your yard does not meet it. I said, my landlord maintains the yard. She said, then he is in violation. I said, file a complaint against him. She said, I am filing it against you. You are the occupant. I said, that is not how it works. She said, I am calling management right now. She did not. She just wrote something in her notebook and left. The second encounter was December 18th. I got a notice in the mail saying my trash bins were visible from the street and had to be stored in the garage. My trash bins were in the assigned bin alcove behind a screen wall, exactly where they were supposed to be. I took photos and sent them to the management company with a note that said, "False complaint. Please remove from my file." They replied and said, "We will investigate." The third encounter was December 20th. I was leaving for work at 6 a.m. and found Brenda sitting in her car across the street with her headlamp on, writing on a clipboard. I waved. She did not wave back. She just wrote faster. On December 22nd, I got a call from a number I did not recognize. I answered. A man said, "This is Derek from All County Towing. I need to confirm a pickup order for your address." I said, "I did not order a tow." He said, "The HOA did." I said, "For what vehicle?" He said, "Silver sedan, plate number matching your registration." I said, "My car is legally parked." He said, "They said it is abandoned." I said, "It is not. I drove it this morning." He said, "Look, man, I am just doing my job. If you say it is not abandoned, I am not touching it." I said, "Do you have written authorization?" He said, "Just a voicemail from someone named Brenda." I said, "Can you send me a copy?" He said, "I can email you the call log." He did. The voicemail said, "This is Irene Baker with Meadows Landing Association. We have an abandoned vehicle at 4739 Cypress Court. Please remove it immediately and bill the resident." I forwarded it to Sam and said, "She is trying again." He replied, "Save everything. This is evidence of harassment." The hearing was set for 6 p.m. on December 23rd. I showed up at 5:45. The community center meeting room was cold and smelled like old coffee. There were 8 folding chairs arranged in a U-shape. Brenda was already there, sitting at the far end with a stack of file folders. She had her headlamp on even though the overhead lights were on. The board president, a man in his 70s named Donald, sat in the center. 2 other board members sat on either side of him. I recognized one as the treasurer, a woman named Yolanda. I did not recognize the other. Sam Torres sat in the back corner as an observer. I sat across from Brenda. Donald said, "Let us get started. This is an emergency compliance hearing requested by the resident of 4739 Cypress Court regarding alleged violations and HOA actions. Miss Baker, please present your case." Brenda opened a folder. She said, "The resident installed an unapproved exterior feature without board consent. The feature, a heated bird bath, attracts pests and creates a nuisance. He has refused repeated requests to remove it. He has also parked in violation of updated snow event protocols and failed to maintain required fencing. I request immediate removal of the feature and imposition of fines totaling $300. Donald looked at me. He said, "Your response." I opened my folder. I said, "First, the bird bath is not a decoration. It is a functional wildlife water source during freezing temperatures. Second, there is no rule requiring board approval for bird baths. Miss Baker cited a decoration rule, but bird baths are explicitly exempt under the landscaping guidelines. Third, the parking violation was based on a rule change that does not exist. The management company confirmed no email was sent and no board vote occurred. Fourth, Miss Baker has repeatedly claimed enforcement authority she does not have. She authorized a tow without board approval, demanded entry to my home without proper notice, and filed multiple false complaints. I have voice recordings, doorbell video, and written evidence of all of this. I request that the fines be dismissed and that Miss Baker be investigated for exceeding her authority." I handed Donald a flash drive. I said, "Everything is on here." He took it. Brenda said, "Those recordings are illegal." I said, "No, they are not. California is a 2-party consent state for private conversations, but this was HOA business conducted on HOA property and at my home. She had no expectation of privacy." Donald said, "We will review the evidence." Brenda said, "He is lying. He is trying to." Donald cut her off. He said, Miss Baker, please. He looked at the treasurer. He said, Yolanda, do we have a record of the board vote on the parking rule? Yolanda opened a binder. She flipped pages. She said no. The last parking vote was in June. Donald said, so there was no rule change. Yolanda said, correct. Donald looked at Brenda. He said, did you send an email to residents about a parking rule change? She said yes. He said, when? She said, December 13th. He said, do you have a copy? She said, it is on the server. He said, can you pull it up now? She said, I do not have access right now. Donald said, why not? She said, technical issues. Donald said, Yolanda, can you check the server? Yolanda pulled out a laptop. She typed. She said, there is no email from Miss Baker on December 13th. There is no draft. There is no sent record. Brenda said, that is impossible. Yolanda said, I am looking at the logs right now. Nothing. Donald leaned back. He said, Miss Baker, did you authorize a tow without board approval? She said, I have enforcement discretion. He said, no, you do not. The communications director role does not include enforcement authority. That is reserved for the board president and the management company. She said, I was acting on behalf of the board. He said, did the board vote to authorize the tow? She said, no, but. He said, then you exceeded your authority. She said, he is non-compliant. He said, based on a rule that does not exist. She said nothing. Donald said, what about the fencing complaint? I said, I do not have a fence and I am not required to have one. My landlord maintains the landscaping to HOA standards. Brenda said, the yard does not meet the standard. Donald said, what standard? Brenda said, the visual cohesion standard. Donald said, that is not a thing. She said, it is in the guidelines. Donald said, show me. She opened a folder. She flipped pages. She stopped. She closed the folder. She said, I will have to get back to you. Donald said, no. Show me now or withdraw the complaint. She said nothing. Donald said, complaint withdrawn. I said, there is one more thing. I pulled out my phone. I said, on December 20th, I received a call from All County Towing saying Miss Baker left a voicemail claiming my car was abandoned and requesting an immediate tow. My car was not abandoned. I drove it that morning. She made a false report to a tow company in an attempt to harass me. I played the voicemail on speaker. Brenda's voice filled the room. This is Irene Baker with Meadows Landing Association. We have an abandoned vehicle at 4739 Cypress Court. Please remove it immediately and bill the resident. Donald closed his eyes. Yolanda said, oh my God. The third board member, who had not said anything, said, that is fraud. Brenda said, it was a mistake. I said, it was not a mistake. She has been harassing me for 2 weeks because I put up a bird bath. She has filed false complaints, lied about rule changes, demanded illegal access to my home, and tried to tow my car twice. She has also been trespassing on my property at night. I have doorbell footage of her posting a notice at 11 p.m. while wearing a headlamp. I pulled up the video on my phone and held it up. Donald watched. He said, Miss Baker, is that you? She said, I was delivering a compliance notice. He said, at 11 p.m. She said, I was available then. He said, that is trespassing. She said, HOA representatives have access to all common areas. He said, a resident's front porch is not a common area. She said nothing. Sam Torres stood up from the back. He said, if I may, I am Sam Torres, a licensed mediator. I was copied on the resident's complaint and I submitted a formal mediation request to the board. I have reviewed all the evidence. Miss Baker has repeatedly acted outside her authority, made false claims, and engaged in what appears to be a targeted harassment campaign. I recommend the board dismiss all fines, issue a formal apology to the resident, and open an internal review of Miss Baker's conduct. Donald said, noted. He looked at Brenda. He said, "Do you have anything else to say?" She said, "You cannot prove anything." I said, "Actually, I can." I pulled out a piece of paper. I said, "This is a written statement from Derek at All County Towing. He describes receiving multiple calls from Miss Baker over the past 2 weeks requesting tows for vehicles that were not in violation. He also states that Miss Baker instructed him to bill residents directly without board authorization. That is fraud." I handed the paper to Donald. He read it. He handed it to Yolanda. She read it. She said, "This is serious." Donald said, "Miss Baker, I am suspending your access to HOA communications and enforcement pending a full board review. You are not to contact this resident again. You are not to issue any notices, fines, or authorizations. Do you understand?" She said, "This is retaliation." Donald said, "No, this is accountability." She stood up. She said, "I am calling management right now." Donald said, "Sit down." She did not. She walked out. The door slammed. Donald looked at me. He said, "I apologize. This should not have happened. Your fines are dismissed. Your complaint is closed. If she contacts you again, call the police." I said, "Thank you." He said, "One more thing. Keep the bird bath. It is not a violation." I said, "I appreciate that." He said, "We are going to have a larger conversation about oversight. This is not the first complaint we have had about Miss Baker." I said, "Good." I stood up. Sam came over. He said, "Well done." I said, "What happens now?" He said, "The board will review her conduct. If they find evidence of fraud or misuse of funds, they will refer it to the authorities." I said, "What are the chances?" He said, "Higher than you think." I left. I went home. I sat on my porch and watched the bird bath steam in the cold air. 3 Juncos landed and drank. I felt good. 2 days later, on Christmas morning, I got a call from Donald. He said, "I wanted to let you know. We completed an emergency audit of HOA finances. We found discrepancies in the enforcement account. Miss Baker had been issuing fines and tow authorizations without board approval and pocketing the payments. She also billed the HOA for services that were never performed. We have referred the matter to the Roseville Police Department and the district attorney. She has been removed from the board and banned from all HOA property." I said, "How much?" He said, "Approximately $18,000 over 2 years." I said, "Wow." He said, "We are working with an attorney to recover the funds and to notify affected residents. You may be contacted as part of the investigation." I said, "I will cooperate." He said, "Thank you. And again, I apologize. This should never have happened." I said, "I appreciate you handling it." He said, "Merry Christmas." I said, "You too." I hung up. The next week, I got a visit from a Roseville police detective. She asked about my interactions with Brenda. I gave her copies of all my recordings, videos, emails, and the tow company statement. She said, "This is helpful. We are building a case." I said, "What is she charged with?" She said, "Fraud, embezzlement, and harassment. Possibly more depending on what else we find." I said, "Will I have to testify?" She said, "Probably." I said, "I am fine with that." She said, "Good." She left. I went back to work. My customers asked how the HOA thing turned out. I told them. Word spread. By the end of January, I had 3 new clients who lived in Meadows Landing. They all said the same thing. They said, "We heard what you did. Thank you." One of them, a woman named Diane, said, "Brenda tried the same thing with me last year. She claimed my mailbox was the wrong color and fined me $200. I paid it because I did not know I could fight it." I said, "You should talk to the police." She said, "I will." In February, the board sent a letter to all residents. It said, "Following an internal audit, former Communications Director Irene Baker has been removed from her position and is under investigation for financial misconduct. The board is working with legal counsel to recover misappropriated funds and to implement stronger oversight procedures. We apologize to any residents who were affected by unauthorized fines or enforcement actions. If you believe you were wrongly charged, please contact the management company for a review. The letter was signed by Donald. I kept a copy. In March, Brenda was formally charged. The local paper ran a story. The headline said, HOA director charged with embezzlement. The article detailed the missing money, the false fines, and the harassment complaints. My name was not mentioned. I was fine with that. In April, I got a check in the mail from the HOA. It was a refund for the $300 in dismissed fines, plus an additional $200 in compensation for harassment and inconvenience. The letter said, "The board deeply regrets the actions taken by former Director Baker and is committed to ensuring this does not happen again." I cashed the check. I bought a second bird bath and put it in the backyard. In May, Brenda pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud. She was sentenced to 18 months in county jail and ordered to pay full restitution. The local news covered it. I did not watch. I heard about it from Paul, my attorney customer. He said, "You did good. A lot of people would have just taken the bird bath down." I said, "I did not want to." He said, "That is why you won." I said, "I guess." He said, "No." "Really? You stood up and you had the proof." "That is all it takes." I said, "And a lot of luck." He said, "Maybe. But you made the luck." I said, "Fair enough." That summer, the board held an election. Donald stepped down. Yolanda became president. She sent a personal email to me. She said, "Thank you for your patience and your courage. The board is implementing new policies to prevent future abuses. We are also establishing a resident ombudsman position to handle complaints independently. If you are interested in serving on a committee, please let us know." I replied and said, "I appreciate the offer, but I am good. I just want to cut hair and feed birds." She replied and said, "Understood. Thank you again." I still live in Meadows Landing. The bird baths are still up. I see the same juncos every morning. Brenda is out of jail now, on probation. I heard she moved to another city. I do not think about her much. When I do, I think about that moment in the hearing when Donald asked her to show the rule, and she could not. I think about her voice on the tow company voicemail. I think about the look on her face when I played it for the board. I think about her saying, "You cannot prove anything." And I think about how wrong she was. The whole thing taught me something. It taught me that HOAs are only as good or as bad as the people running them. It taught me that documentation is everything. It taught me that standing up is hard, but possible. It taught me that most people, when pushed, will do the right thing if you give them the evidence and the chance. And it taught me that a cheap flashlight headlamp can become a signature detail in a story about power, abuse, and accountability. I still have that first violation notice Brenda left on my door. I keep it in a drawer. Sometimes I pull it out and read it. It reminds me that I could have just taken the bird bath down. I could have avoided all of it. But I did not. And I am glad.